I need you to listen very closely, because what I'm about to reveal in the next few minutes contradicts almost everything you've been taught about success, control, and planning. Back in August of 2025, Andrew Huberman dropped an episode on cortisol regulation and burnout that basically short-circuited my brain. He was describing a specific neurological pattern, one that I think a lot of you are experiencing right now. People who obsessively try to control every aspect of their lives end up with a completely inverted cortisol circadian rhythm. They wake up tired, exhausted, with absolutely no energy. But at night, when they should be winding down, their brains are firing on all cylinders, mental rumination, incessant worrying, an inability to sleep, even when they're completely wiped out. And that's when it hit me. Huberman was neurologically describing something that Carl Jung documented over 100 years ago. Jung called it the control compulsion, and he made it clear that this isn't strength. It's a reaction to fear. It's the ego desperately trying to protect itself from what it perceives as chaos. Let me tell you what's really happening in your brain when you can't stop worrying. Because the neuroscience of 2025 finally proved that Jung was right about something that seemed, frankly, impossible. When you stop trying to control, everything clicks into place, and this isn't just some kind of magical thinking, it's a measurable neurological mechanism. But hold on, because what Huberman discovered about the default mode network is going to completely change how you understand worry. Jung wrote a sentence back in 1934 that haunts me to this day. He said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." For decades, this was considered abstract philosophy, a Swiss mysticism, until modern neuroimaging revealed that there's a specific brain network that activates when you're turned inward versus when you're turned outward. That network is called the default mode network, and it's literally the neural system of worry. Huberman explained this in January of 2025 in his essential episode on stress and anxiety. When you're not focused on a specific external task, your default mode network automatically activates. And what does it do? It starts to wander. It starts to ruminate about the past. It starts to worry about the future. It starts to create catastrophic scenarios that are probably never going to happen. The problem is, most people don't even realize this system is active. You're driving to work, and you don't even remember the drive. Why? Because your default mode network hijacked your mind. You started thinking about something neutral, and you ended up ruminating about that awkward conversation from 3 years ago, or worrying about a meeting that hasn't even happened yet. Jung called this being possessed by the complexes. Huberman calls it dysfunctional rumination. It's the same thing, described with different languages, separated by a century. And here's what you need to understand. This constant rumination isn't just uncomfortable. It's literally modifying the structure of your brain. Studies published in 2024 showed that people with chronic rumination have increased connectivity between the default mode network and the subgenual prefrontal cortex. That's the region associated with depression and self-critical thinking. The more you ruminate, the stronger this connection gets. The stronger this connection gets, the easier it is to ruminate. It's a self-feeding cycle. But here's what Jung discovered 100 years ago, that Huberman can now prove with brain scanners. Jung noticed that his most anxious patients had something in common. They were all obsessively trying to control what couldn't be controlled. And the more they tried, the worse they got. But when some external event forced them to give up, something strange would happen. Things would start to align in ways that seemed impossible. Jung called this phenomenon synchronicity. Meaningful coincidences that have no causal explanation but carry profound psychological significance. For decades, scientists ridiculed this concept. It seemed like magical thinking, wishful thinking, mysticism in disguise, until neuroscience discovered what really happens in the brain when you stop trying to control. Huberman discussed this with Jungian psychoanalyst Dr. James Hollis in May of 2024. Hollis explained that the control compulsion is the ego reacting to fear. When you're obsessed with how things should be, you disconnect from how they actually are. You lose access to intuition. You lose access to subtle signals. You lose access to the deeper intelligence that operates beyond the conscious mind. Jung called this the capital S self, a transcendent psychic instance that governs the instincts, the nature seeking its own expression and healing. And this self has two main agendas: to heal when wounded and to express itself, the same way the acorn becomes the mighty oak. Now think about it. What happens when you're constantly worried? Your conscious mind is too busy trying to control outcomes. You don't have the mental bandwidth to perceive opportunities. You can't hear your intuition. You're so focused on what could go wrong that you can't see what could go right. And here's the part that's going to blow your mind. Huberman discovered that there's a specific neurological mechanism that activates when you stop worrying. When you practice focused meditation on interoceptive awareness, which means attention to the internal states of your body, or exteroceptive awareness, which means attention to the external environment, something fascinating happens. The activity of the default mode network decreases, the rumination stops, and another brain network takes over. This network allows you to perceive connections that were previously invisible, allows you to notice opportunities that your worried brain was filtering out, allows you to act more intuitively and less forced. Jung described this as the transcendent function, the ability of the psyche to integrate opposites and generate creative solutions that the conscious mind alone couldn't produce. And this function only operates when the ego relaxes its grip. But wait, because there's one more layer that Huberman revealed in 2025 that connects all of this to cortisol. When you're chronically worried, your cortisol gets dysregulated, and not in the way most people think. You don't necessarily have high cortisol all the time. What happens is your cortisol circadian rhythm inverts. Normally, cortisol should be high in the morning to give you energy and low at night to allow for sleep. But people with chronic rumination often experience the opposite. They wake up with low cortisol, tired, unmotivated, brain fog, and at night, when they should be relaxing, the cortisol spikes, the mind races, the thoughts accelerate. The sleep doesn't come. Huberman explained that this pattern is characteristic of advanced burnout, and it's directly linked to the inability to let go of control. Now, let's unpack the connection that Carl Jung made a century ago. He observed that his most anxious patients were the ones who resisted the natural flow of life the most, those who tried to force specific outcomes, who couldn't accept uncertainty. And he noticed a consistent pattern. The more they struggled, the more things went wrong. The more they tried to control, the less real control they actually had. But when something forced these patients to give up, usually a crisis, an illness, a significant loss, something strange would happen. Synchronistic events started popping up. Opportunities emerged from unexpected places. Relationships reconfigured themselves. Life seemed to start flowing again. Jung didn't have the technology to explain why this was happening, but now we do. Let me tell you about a case Jung documented in 1928 that perfectly illustrates this pattern. A 42-year-old patient came to Jung's office in Zurich, completely shattered. She had spent 6 years trying to save her marriage. 6 years analyzing every conversation, planning every word, trying to control every interaction to avoid conflict. And the more she tried, the worse the marriage became. Jung observed that she was in a state of chronic exhaustion. She slept poorly, thought obsessively. Her entire life had become an attempt to control something that couldn't be controlled, which was the reactions and emotions of another person. He suggested something radical for the time, that she stop trying. Not give up on the marriage, but stop trying to control it, that she focus on herself, that she live her own life, that she let whatever happens, happen. 3 months later, she returned to his office, transformed, not because the marriage had improved, but because she had stopped suffering from anticipation, and something interesting happened. When she stopped trying to control, her husband started to approach her on his own. The dynamics she'd been trying to force for years started happening naturally. Jung noted that this wasn't coincidence. It was what he would later call synchronicity. When the ego stops interfering, the psyche finds its own balance. Andrew Huberman would explain this another way. When she stopped obsessively ruminating, her nervous system came out of chronic threat mode. She became calmer, more present, more pleasant to be around. And that changed how others responded to her. It's not magic. It's interpersonal neurobiology. When you stop obsessively worrying, 3 things happen in your brain simultaneously. First, your default mode network reduces activity. The rumination diminishes. You stop creating imaginary catastrophic scenarios. This frees up massive cognitive resources that were being consumed by unproductive worry. Second, your cortisol circadian rhythm begins to normalize. You wake up with more energy. At night, you can relax. Your nervous system exits chronic survival mode. This literally affects everything, from your ability to think clearly to your immune system. Third, and this is the most important, you activate what Huberman calls a receptive state. Your brain's salience network becomes more sensitive. You start to notice things that were always there, but that your worried brain was filtering out. Opportunities, connections, patterns, synchronicity. Jung would call this opening to the unconscious. Huberman calls it adaptive neuroplasticity. It's the same phenomenon, described with vocabularies from different eras. But here's the paradox that most people can't accept. You can't force this state. Trying to force relaxation is just another form of control. It's just another manifestation of the control compulsion that created the problem in the first place. It's like trying to sleep by trying to sleep. The more you try, the harder it becomes. Jung understood this deeply. He wrote that true surrender isn't about turning away from life, it's about entering into it completely. It's not passive, but deeply active. It means trusting in the rhythms of life, embracing uncertainty, and allowing new things to emerge. Letting go means releasing control over outcomes, but remaining present in the process. And that distinction is crucial, because many people confuse stopping worry with not caring, confuse surrender with giving up, confuse releasing control with losing direction. That's not it. What Jung and Huberman are describing is a state where you act without forcing, where you exert effort without unnecessary tension, where you work towards your goals but aren't emotionally devastated if things don't go exactly as you planned. Huberman has a technique that he calls no-go moments. 25 times a day, he consciously suppresses the impulse to take an action. Small moments where he purposefully doesn't act on a thought or urge. This strengthens the prefrontal cortex, increases self-control, but the right kind of self-control, not the control that tries to manipulate reality, the control that allows you to choose your responses consciously. And here's where this connects with what Jung discovered about the capital S self. Jung said we all need to find what sustains us when nothing else does. Hollis and Huberman define meditation as a deliberate perceptual shift directly aimed at better understanding unconscious processing. This allows you to enter the stimulus response parts of life with more authenticity. When you stop trying to control obsessively, you don't lose strength. You gain access to a different form of strength, a strength that doesn't depend on manipulating external circumstances. A strength that comes from being aligned with something larger than the conscious ego. Jung called this individuation, the process of becoming who you really are, not who you think you should be. And that process requires you to release many of the illusions of control that the ego has built. But hold on, because I need to show you the specific protocol that Huberman recommends for breaking the cycle of chronic rumination. First, morning sunlight. Within the first hour after waking up, exposure to natural light. This adjusts your cortisol peak to the correct time of day. It seems too simple to work, but the studies are clear. Morning light is one of the most powerful regulators of your circadian rhythm. Second, delay caffeine. Huberman recommends waiting 60 to 90 minutes after waking up before consuming coffee. Why? Because caffeine, immediately after waking up, interferes with the natural cortisol peak. You end up needing more caffeine for the same effect, and your rhythm becomes even more dysregulated. Third, exercise at the right time. In the morning or early afternoon, not at night. Exercising too late can keep cortisol elevated when it should be dropping. All right, let's dive deeper. Fourth, to dial down that cortisol at night. Dim the lights. Seriously, avoid screens like the plague. Practice relaxation techniques. And here's a little trick from Huberman himself. Try incorporating some carbohydrates into your dinner. Sounds counterintuitive, right? But it can actually help lower cortisol levels and prime you for sleep. Fifth, and maybe the most important, physiological sigh breathing. 2 quick inhales through the nose, followed by 1 long, slow exhale through the mouth. Huberman swears this is the ultimate real-time tool for calming down. It works immediately because it activates the parasympathetic nervous system, your body's natural chill-out response. Sixth, NSDR, non-sleep deep rest. 11 to 30 minutes of this can significantly reduce cortisol. Especially useful if you wake up already feeling stressed, with your cortisol levels spiking way too fast. NSDR or even yoga nidra can help flatten that curve. Seventh, and this is something Huberman specifically touched on in his episode about erasing fears and traumas, deliberate, prolonged exposure. When you confront the thing that scares you in a controlled environment, repeatedly, the circuits connecting your amygdala, your prefrontal cortex, and your dopamine systems, they literally rewire themselves. You're training your brain not to overreact. Carl Jung, the OG himself, he called this confronting the shadow, going toward what you fear instead of running away. Not recklessly, mind you, but consciously and gradually. And he observed that patients who did this reported a feeling of liberation they couldn't quite explain. It was like the monster they feared, when finally faced, turned out to be much smaller than it appeared in the shadows. Huberman validated this with hardcore neuroimaging. The amygdala. That's the brain's fear center, remember? It reduces its response to stimuli after repeated exposure. It's an adaptation mechanism. Your brain learns that the thing isn't as dangerous as the alarm system initially suggested. And here's something that connects deeply with Jung. Most of the things we worry about never happen. Studies show that around 85% of people's worries never materialize. And of the ones that do, most people handle them better than they anticipated. So why do we worry so much? Jung would say that worry is an ego mechanism, a desperate attempt to maintain the illusion of control. If I worry enough, maybe I can prevent disaster. It's magical thinking disguised as prudence. Huberman would argue that worry is an evolutionary bug. Our ancestors who worried more survived more. But now, we live in an environment where most of the threats are imaginary. And our brains haven't quite caught up. Either way, the outcome is the same: massive energy expenditure on problems that don't exist. And when real problems do appear, you're so exhausted from preemptive worrying that you don't have the resources to deal with them. But here's what most people don't understand. These protocols, these techniques, they don't work if you do them obsessively, trying to control your state. If you're doing physiological sigh breathing while thinking, this has to work, you're still in control mode. You need to approach these practices with an attitude of curiosity, not desperation. Jung would say you need to approach these techniques as an experiment, not as a requirement. Allow them to work, don't force them to work. And that brings us to the deepest concept that Jung developed: active surrender. Most people understand surrender as passivity, as giving up, as doing nothing. But Jung described something different, a surrender that's deeply active, where you're fully engaged in life but not attached to specific outcomes. It's like the Zen archer. You train your technique tirelessly, you aim with precision, you release the arrow, but after you release it, you don't try to control where it goes. You trust the process, trust the training, trust in something beyond conscious control. Huberman described this in terms of neuroplasticity. When you're trying to force change, you're in sympathetic mode, stress, tension, high cortisol, and paradoxically, that state makes change harder. Your brain is in protection mode, not growth mode. But when you relax into the process, when you're engaged but not tense, you enter parasympathetic mode, recovery, integration. And it's in that state that true neuroplasticity happens. That's when new connections form, when old patterns dissolve, when real change occurs. Jung called this the opus, the alchemical work, where you apply effort, but also allow forces beyond the conscious ego to operate. It's not doing nothing, it's doing everything within your power, and then releasing the rest. And now, I need to tell you about the most fascinating study that connects all of this. Researchers in 2024 measured what happens in the brains of people who practice loving kindness meditation. That's a practice where you cultivate feelings of kindness and compassion, first for yourself, then for others. The results were astonishing. The default mode network of these people showed different patterns. Less activation in the regions associated with self-criticism, more activation in the regions associated with positive self-regulation, and something else. The connectivity between brain regions that don't normally communicate increased. It's like releasing obsessive self-criticism, opens channels of communication in the brain that constant worry kept closed. Jung predicted this. He wrote about how the shadow, the rejected parts of the capital S self, consumes enormous psychic energy when it's not integrated, when you're constantly criticizing yourself, judging yourself, worrying. You're spending resources that could be going to creativity, intuition, presence. Huberman confirmed the neurobiology. Chronic rumination, that is, obsessive worrying, requires significant metabolic resources. The prefrontal cortex, constantly working to try and solve imaginary problems, burns glucose. Literally, your brain is consuming fuel to generate unproductive worry. When you stop, that energy becomes available for other things. You think more clearly, perceive more, connect ideas in new ways. That's why insights often come when you're relaxed, in the shower, walking, not trying to solve the problem. And here's the point that unites Jung and Huberman definitively. Both understood that the conscious ego has severe limitations. The rational mind can process about 7 items simultaneously, but the unconscious, or what Huberman would call subcortical processing, operates on a completely different scale. Millions of processes happening in parallel below the level of awareness. When you're obsessed with trying to control everything consciously, you're trying to use the small part of the brain to do the work of the enormous part. It's like trying to calculate the global weather with a pocket calculator. You simply don't have enough processing power. You are limited by your brain. But when you relax your conscious control, you allow unconscious processing to contribute. And that is vastly more powerful. It can see patterns your conscious mind misses. It can make connections that seem impossible. It can generate solutions your rational mind would never find. Carl Jung called this the compensatory function of the unconscious. Andrew Huberman would call it implicit subcortical processing. It's the same phenomenon, and it only operates fully when you stop trying to consciously control everything. And that's why when you stop worrying, things start to fall into place. It's not magic. It's not positive thinking. It's neurobiology. You're finally letting your whole brain work on the problem instead of overloading one small part of it. But I need to be honest about something important. This doesn't mean you'll never have problems. It doesn't mean everything will magically work out. It means you'll deal with problems differently, with more resources available, with more clarity, with less unnecessary suffering caused by unproductive worry. Jung was a realist about this. He didn't promise a life without hardship. He promised a life with more meaning, a life where you're aligned with something larger than your ego's concerns, a life where you can find purpose even in suffering. Huberman would be equally realistic. The protocols don't eliminate stress. They help you respond to stress more adaptively, to recover more quickly, to not create additional stress through unproductive rumination. And that brings me to the question that Jung considered the most important in human life. Are you living your own life, or are you living the life you think you should be living? Because so much chronic worry comes from that discrepancy. You're trying to control outcomes that aren't actually yours to control. You're trying to force a path that isn't authentically yours. You're expending enormous energy trying to be someone you're not. Jung called this living the persona instead of the capital S self. The persona is the social mask, the role you play. It's necessary to function in society, but it's not you. And when you confuse the persona with who you really are, you live in constant conflict. Huberman would describe this in terms of misalignment between conscious goals and unconscious tendencies. When what you consciously want doesn't match what you unconsciously seek. You create constant internal friction. Your nervous system is always in conflict. Your cortisol circadian rhythm never normalizes because you're perpetually at war with yourself. And the only way out is to stop fighting, not to stop acting, not to stop striving, but to stop fighting against who you really are. To stop trying to control what can't be controlled, to stop creating suffering through resistance to what is. Jung called this saying yes to life. Accepting the totality of experience, including the uncertainty, including the loss, including your own mortality, not as passive resignation, but as active embrace. And when you do that, something shifts. Your nervous system relaxes. Your cortisol circadian rhythm normalizes. Your default mode network stops ruminating obsessively. You start to perceive opportunities that were always there. Connections that seemed impossible become obvious. Things fall into place. Not because you forced it, but because you finally stopped forcing it. You've just received information that took me years to research. Connecting Jung, modern neuroscience, and Andrew Huberman's latest studies on cortisol and rumination. This content exists because there's a group of people who believes that uniting deep psychology with modern science matters. Each video takes dozens of hours of research, reading studies, translating complex concepts into accessible language, and doing it while the platforms bury deep content in favor of shallow entertainment. The super thanks isn't just financial support. It's you saying, continue revealing these connections. When you click the golden heart, you fund the next revelation. You make it possible for more people to wake up to what Jung knew and Huberman is proving. You're not a passive spectator. You're part of a movement that refuses to accept the artificial separation between ancient wisdom and modern science. Now I want to hear from you. What was the moment you stopped fighting and things started to align? I want real stories, not theory, not what you think should have happened, the concrete moment when you let go and something shifted. Write in the comments, I let go, and tell me what happened. Because when you publicly name that moment, you solidify the memory. You create a reference for yourself that this is possible, and you show others who are still struggling that there's another way. Jung drew the map 100 years ago. Huberman is translating it into neural language now. But the journey is yours. And it starts the moment you stop trying to control and allow things to fall into place.